Bienvenidos a todos. Thank you for tuning in to Lobo Lenguas, a podcast on behalf of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. This podcast hopes to be a safe forum where we hold candid conversations, sometimes uncomfortable, but cover a variety of topics to engage our listeners into discovering the wide range of diversity that we have at Sul State University and in West Texas. My name is Melissa Montoya. My pronouns are she, hers, ella. I am an English graduate student and your host today. For this episode, we are collaborating with both Dr. Velasco and graduate student Parker Duff. I'm gonna let everybody introduce themselves in just a second, but I want to remind everyone that this is a free-flowing conversational type of podcast, so relax, take a breather. If you want to laugh, if you want to cry, if you want to cuss, I don't know. This is a no judgment zone. So I'll start off with Dr. Jessica Velasco, if she can introduce herself.
Hello, I'm Dr. Jessica Velasco. I teach political science and public administration. I'm the chair of Parker's Master of Arts and Liberal Arts committee, and I'm happy to be here today.
Awesome.
And I'm Dr. Joseph Velasco, Associate Professor of Communication, and I am so happy to be serving on this committee for Parker.
Nice. Parker?
My name is Parker Duff. I am a graduate student in the liberal arts program, and I'm also I'm not in Alpine. I'm in Lubbock, Texas, so up in the Panhandle. And I'm also a citizen of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm very proud of the work I've done, and just happy to be at the very end. So, hello.
Nice. You say the very end, and the graduate students are like, "What? There's an end?" Parker, we want you to talk to us. Tell us briefly about your project and how did you select this topic for your graduate project? I know you briefly mentioned that you are part of the, did you say Choctaw?
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. So yeah, tell us about your project and how did you come across this?
Well, so when I entered graduate school, I really wanted to focus on Indigenous sovereignty as a whole and history. It's the kind of the two things that I care about the most. And so when you have a confluence of interest like that, usually the best work comes from that. So that's why entering into the degree, I really wanted to focus on Indigenous government. And so that's how I got to this study and to the topic. But really, this topic comes out of a genesis of a class I took with Dr. James Case. And the book that was central to that class is called Forced Federalism by Corntassel and Whitmer. And it explores a policy of devolution in tribal sovereignty from the federal level, where tribes are dealing directly with the United States federal government, to having to deal more with state governments on a more peer-to-peer level, which is something new in 21st century indigenous sovereignty, but not new in the history of indigenous relations. So that's kind of where the project idea comes from. I also have the unfortunate love of really liking to read Supreme Court opinions, and so they're actually a lot of fun. And so I wanted to see if I could kind of create a study around the intersection between the Supreme Court and legal decisions, and then also the reality that faces Native Americans and their nations throughout the history of the United States, and their dealings with both. And luckily it came off to be the project I have now. Many of the reasons that this works is because Indigenous nations inhabit a very different area in terms of what we would normally see as like a pyramid of hierarchy, where you have the federal government at the top, state governments, local and municipalities below those. And the Indigenous nations don't necessarily inhabit a direct line. They kind of sit in a pot on the side of that pyramid. And so, and their level is always changing, and it's very fluid. And so understanding that through study and understanding that through lived experience, wanted that's where I wanted to go with the study to see, what really is the truth um, behind indigenous sovereignty and what it means to be a sovereign nation and a person of those nations in the United States today.
Okay, I see. And the topic, natives are a marginalized community. So this is a topic that does need awareness. In your opinion, which court cases have been the most significant in defining the current status of indigenous nations, and why?
So I would love to say all of them, but um, that's probably too long for this kind of a forum. I have selected a few that I think are probably the most important in my opinion, as you say in the question. And I'm going to start out with probably the three most famous court cases in indigenous law, and it's called the Marshall Trilogy. It's so called that because Chief Justice John Marshall wrote the opinions for these cases in 1823, 1831, and 1832. These cases are Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee v. Georgia, and Worcester v. Georgia. These cases really outline who has the right to deal with Native nations. Is it the federal government? Is it the state governments? Or is it local municipalities? And in these cases, the court decides on a number of factors that only the United States federal government has the purview to actually deal with indigenous nations. The reason that they decide that are a couple of kind of interesting readings of law. First off, they take it through the Indian Commerce Clause, a clause in the United States Constitution that states that Congress has the right to regulate trade and intercourse with all Native American nations. Now, when the Constitution was written, usually you're talking about Native nations on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, though by that time, the United States was definitely looking out west towards other nations, and they knew that there were indigenous nations all across the United States and or the continent that would become the United States. But in these three cases, the court really outlines that the states don't have the right to treat with indigenous nations because they are sovereign, and they're sovereign separate from the United States. In one of the cases, I want to say it's Cherokee v. Georgia, Chief Justice Marshall coins a term that will come to define the rest of indigenous case law and really the way all of Congress and the way the Supreme Court has looked at indigenous nations. He calls them domestic dependent nations. So they are as a ward to its guardian, is what he says in this case. And so those are the first three cases that set the foundation for indigenous law going forward. And it's not until 1886, after removal has begun and westward expansion has been nearly completed, that the next kind of big case, in my opinion, happens. That's the United States v. Kagama in 1886. It expands federal jurisdiction to all of the native reservations and tribal lands and anything like that. So as the United States marched across the continent and they started reserving lands for the Native Americans and these indigenous nations, there was a call for justice and jurisdiction to happen on these lands. They were seen as kind of lawless areas. But this is also not just something that you can say is because Native Americans were ungovernable. It was mostly because this is a part of something called the assimilation policy. This policy comes through early in the 1800s, and it's seen as a way to make Native Americans more white in everything they do, from their political ideology to the way that they work to the way that they practice religion. And so this assimilation policy wanted to really push back on anything native, so restrict anything they could do that was seen as native. So this is where you get the outlawing. In that time period, you get the outlawing of the ghost dance, or the different dances, the emergence of the ghost dance in the western part of the United States. You see tribes trying to claw back just little bits of land that have been stolen from them or have been allotted away from them. And so Kagama expands federal judicial jurisdiction over these lands, and they do this using that same idea of domestic dependent nations and Indian Commerce Clause, as it's called in the Constitution. So they did that to extend federal jurisdiction away from the states and over these Indian nations. Now, there are a bunch of cases that fall in between the 1880s and the 1950s, but those cases come and they switch back a lot. So what that means is they decide one thing, and in the next 10 years it's different. And in this time, there are also a lot of different policies being created. So the assimilation policy is going strong until the 1950s. But that doesn't mean but during that time, we have this very progressive government in the 1930s and 40s under FDR, and he creates something called the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, which helps a lot of tribes create constitutions and then helps them start to reorganize their government after the termination policies that had kind of come through. Even in the 1950s, termination policy returns, and they want to just totally wipe out all kind of trust between Native Americans and the federal government and say, you're on your own, or you get totally devolved to the states. You're not recognized as a government anymore. And then with Lyndon Baines Johnson and then Richard Nixon in the 60s, that comes back and they say, this is a problem. We can't continue to do this. We're going to start a new era, a new policy called self-determination. We're going to give back a lot of things that the federal government has been doing, a lot of powers the federal government has had. We're going to give those back to the states. And so once that's happened, that's kind of a very quick breakdown of what's happening. In 1977, the United States v. Antelope case comes out. And this is a very, very key case because it decides whether the designation as being an indigenous person, Indian as they call it in the courts, is that a political designation or is that something of a racial designation? So U.S. v. Antelope looks to a person was convicted of murder in Idaho, and it's looking to see if he can be tried both by the courts in Idaho or the courts for the native tribe that he's a part of and the federal courts. And this decision definitively stakes out that being an Indian or classified as an Indian in any way, whether that means you're a citizen, whether that means you're affiliated with it in any way, especially if you're a citizen, that's not a racial designation to the United States and in the U.S. legal system. That's a political designation. So the double jeopardy clause of the Fifth Amendment doesn't apply to these people. And so what that means is now federal jurisdiction can go forward and prosecute that case, along with Native American courts can go ahead and prosecute that person as well. And there's just a couple more. I know there's a lot, guys. There's a lot here, but there's a couple more I want to talk about. There's another one, and I forgot to write the date down, so I apologize. But it's Marion, which was a hydrocarbon extraction company versus the Jicarilla Apache in Arizona, and this case comes down to the question of, do Native nations, as nations, do they retain the right to tax companies coming into their land and doing work for them? And so the court goes back and forth on this question. And what it comes down to saying, yes, you're a sovereign nation, so you have jurisdiction over people that are committing crimes and offenses in your area, but you also have the ability and responsibility to tax people that are coming into your area, especially outside businesses. So Marion wanted to not pay the tax to the Apache Nation. They wanted to pay the tax only to the federal government and to Arizona. And the court said, no, these are nations, and you have to abide by their taxation rules. That's part of being a sovereign. So it's a big win in that area for Native nations. It allows them to generate revenue in that way. But there are two more cases before the two. There are four more cases I want to talk about. Two more real quick. Duro v. Reyna happens in 1990, and this limits authority over offenders and violators so let's say as a Choctaw person, I go to the Cherokee reservation in eastern Oklahoma. We're north and south of each other, and I go commit a crime. Under the Duro v. Reyna decision, I couldn't be prosecuted under Cherokee law because I was a Choctaw. Now I'm still a Native American. I could still be held accountable, but only under Duro v. Reyna, I could only be held accountable if I made that crime on the Choctaw reservation. So it was a total stripping of power and a recession or a regression of sovereignty from the past 50 years. But that happened in 1990, but in 2004, a case called U.S. v. Laura comes back and says that's a bad reading of law. And what this case does is it reinstates indigenous authority over all indigenes. I apologize, that is the word. So if I were to go past 2004, commit a crime as a Native American, a Choctaw on Cherokee land, I would be able to be held accountable by the Cherokee courts. And so that's a restoration. And that right there encapsulates a lot of what's happening throughout history for Native American courts. But the last two cases are the most recent cases, and they're probably the most important cases that come up in the last 40 or 50 years. And these cases are McGirt v. Oklahoma in 2020 and Castro Huerta v. Oklahoma in 2022. Now, in the McGirt decision, Justice Gorsuch hands down a decision that states plainly that unless Congress has explicitly eliminated a tribe's claims to land, that area, no matter how long it's been perceived as outside of tribal hands, is still a reservation. It's still Indian country under the law. That's a legal term they use, Indian country. So in 2020, the McGirt case allows the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and a lot of other nations access back to land that has been perceived outside of their jurisdiction. And so it allows Tulsa to be brought back into the fold of the Cherokee Nation. It allows these southern tribes like the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and a lot of other tribes around the country expanded jurisdiction back to the old boundaries of when they were originally gifted this land under the treaties they made with the federal government. And that's great because it allows extension of sovereignty back over lands that have always kind of been theirs by rights. And since Congress has made no express termination of these lands, the court can't say, yeah, well, that's not yours anymore just because for 20, 40, or 30 years, you haven't had that jurisdiction. Now, 2 years later, in 2022, you have the case called Castro Huerta v. Oklahoma, wherein a man who is not a citizen of the United States commits a crime in Tulsa, and the state wanted to try him. So the state of Oklahoma does try him and convicts him to 30 years in prison. But after the McGirt decision comes down, the state vacates that decision because they don't have jurisdiction, they don't have standing. And so what happens is he is quickly re-indicted and reconvicted by the federal district court in eastern Oklahoma. And he is convicted to 7 years in a federal penitentiary instead of 30 years in a state penitentiary. And then because he is a non-resident alien, he would be deported back to his country of origin. Now, this case is being brought up by the governor of Oklahoma at the time and the attorney general. And their argument states that while that's true, that the Cherokee Nation does have jurisdiction, the federal court does have jurisdiction, we as the state of Oklahoma should have concurrent jurisdiction, meaning we have the right to prosecute him as well. And this is a complete rebounding on what McGirt has decided 2 years previous. And what the decision states is, yes, states do have concurrent jurisdiction with the federal government, something that in Oklahoma really hasn't been a thing for many, many years, something out west that hasn't been a thing for many, many years. And it totally repeals and throws a lot more chaos into the McGirt decision. And in that decision, Justice Kavanaugh states that questions like this, jurisdictional questions, they've never really been that big of a deal in the history of indigenous nations and their court cases. And Justice Gorsuch, in his dissent, fires right back and says a more ahistorical reading of the law is hard to imagine. Now, I created themes for all of my cases, and if I'm being quite honest, all but maybe one could fall under the claim of jurisdictional arguments. That's really the biggest understanding and question in front of the court at all times is who has rights to prosecute on this land, who has rights to do anything on this land, where are these rights, what are the limits of these rights. And so those are kind of a quick rundown of cases that are extremely important in my opinion. But it's always going to be, if you really want to know, just go read all of them because that's going to give you a perfect picture. but I like doing that kind of stuff, so I can't, I won't subject anybody to that.
I mean, no, it's okay. We hear this, and it's almost like I think all of us feel, all of us that are not familiar with this, right? We're almost like entranced. It's like Legally Blonde. We're like, we want to use the same terminology. I object, jurisdiction,
Right,
all of
right.
these words, but
Yeah.
you putting this to the forefront will help all of us gain that knowledge. Then we will hop on. To our socials or on the internet and find out. You pique our interest. And
Sure, yeah.
you spoke of assimilation. A lot of us here as minorities, we can relate in a sense. And when you speak about all of this establishing of lines and borders and all of these laws on these landscapes, that a lot of people, there's that turmoil, there's an inner conflict that a lot of us can relate to. But when it comes down to all of the technical aspects that you're speaking of, they're really important. And the things that you're saying are surprising when you think about, I know Thanksgiving is around the corner.
Yes.
Some people call them pilgrims. Some people call them colonizers. But what,
Yes.
it's still surprising to hear almost how slow this is moving in our day and age.
Yeah.
Well, were there any surprises in your research that you came across?
Yeah. Perhaps naively, one of the biggest surprises was just how many times the same question is asked in front of the Supreme Court. We have this kind of idea. It's always in the media kind of portrayed as the Supreme Court has decided. That's the end of that question forever. That's now gonna echo through eternity, and that's really just not the case. Now, there small deviations in how the question is asked. It's more like inflection. It's if I ask it in a different way, is it going to get me a different answer? And that's really what the court does. Is it's all of the sides need to be tested here and there, and so that's been pretty surprising. Another thing that's really surprising in that kind of same vein is how many times the court is, absolutely inconsistent. From year to year, it can be inconsistent. Like especially in the early era of the Republic, like the last two cases of the Marshall trilogy, the court is kind of flip flopping there and saying, well, we kind of said this, but this is really what we meant, and so we're going to kind of try and hold everyone to that, but we don't have an enforcement mechanism. So, famously, President Jackson, after the Worcester decision comes down, he states, well, the Chief Justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. And that echoes a lot of like the court has decided, but what can you do about it? Right now, when the court decides something, it flows much more kind of directly down, and that's through intention of the court becoming more robust in that area. But kind of the biggest surprise that I found were these kind of national myths that everyone talking about Thanksgiving is perfect here. These national myths that come down. It was very surprising when I was reading in my research, kind of background research, that when that first Thanksgiving, we think of pilgrims and the Indians, and they come together and they have this huge Thanksgiving feast, right? But when you read the real history behind it, these natives in the area, the pilgrims weren't hunting for themselves. They were barely farming. They were waiting on the supply ships to come from England. And so they were starving to death. And so what really happens is these Native Americans, they say, well, these guys aren't going to help themselves, and we don't really want them to die because we don't want to get blamed for it. And, we just don't understand. Maybe they don't understand how to hunt, maybe they don't understand how to fish. So let's go give them some food, and kind of really helping them out that way. So it's kind of a gift of, hey guys, you're a little down on your luck. Here's some gifts for you. Here's some food. It's not this kind of mutual meeting of minds that you find. But talking back about assimilation, that's kind of the big theme in Indian relations with the United States. And so these national myths that we have of, I'm sure you've all heard these, or you've all I've dealt with them my entire life. And it's indigenous people as great hunters, or great stewards of the land, or natural artisans, and they're very in touch with Mother Earth, and it's like, yeah, we have restorative farming techniques, but that doesn't make every indigenous person you meet, the most green loving person. We still drink out of plastic bottles, and we still do all those other things that normal people do. The idea of scouting, natives often, when they were put into the army and into to any kind of military aspect, were given as scouts first and foremost, because it was perceived that that was just what they were naturally good at. And again, not any better than anybody else, but hey, if you're going to give us a job to do, we're going to do that job. Also, the idea of a noble savage, of being a link back to pre-civilization. These people are living in the pure form of humanity, before the sin of money and all this other things comes in. Those ideas are long lasting, and they are all founded in this early 1800s movement, which is the assimilation movement. And these people are actually reformers. They're quite liberal for their time, these people coming up with these ideas. And they saw it as a way to help Native Americans. They saw Native Americans as a vanishing race, as a disappearing race, as they would soon be swept from the land by modernity. And so they wanted to preserve, in this almost museum-like fashion, little pockets of Native Americans, and so that people could go and see, hey, look, this is what it looks like before, industrialization and agriculture. And that's just not true. But that's the way people looked at it. And so those were really surprising to see, that they were only really these myths were only really created in the early to mid 19th century, and they still endure today. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I get told in anything that I do, if I bring up Native American stuff, is, oh, well, we just need to, we need to really treat the land the way the natives did and give back. I'm all for restorative and land back justice, but don't expect that that's going to be, a Garden of Eden is going to spring up just because you give the land back. That's not really how it works, And then there's also from Forced Federalism, the book, there's this new thing called rich Indian racism. And I've dealt with this. This one is a lot more close to home. I used to get questions all the time, and I still do now. It's like, oh, you're a Native American? That's cool. So do you get like a check from the reservation like every month or something? And that just doesn't really happen. There are royalty checks out there, but not every nation does that. And not every nation and not every person living on or off the reservation has that opportunity to get that kind of stuff. That stuff doesn't always happen. And in Forced Federalism, there's this cartoon, The Family Circus, which I think we've all seen on the Sunday papers. The Family Circus is usually a very wholesome, Sunday comic. And in one of the pictures, it says, oh, it's the two, young sons, and they say, oh, we're going to play cowboys and Indians. And the one kid is in, chaps and a cowboy boot and vest. And he's got a 6-shooters, and the other kid's in a business suit. And he's like, well, I thought you were supposed to be, the Indian. And he goes, oh, I am. We just own the casino now. And that kind of stuff is hurtful, because that's the reason. The reason we have gambling is because there's nothing else that we can do on the land. This land isn't farmable. It's not arable for the most part. There's no jobs, there's no infrastructure flowing in there. And so for a lot of the things that we're doing, we're left with one or two things. And one of the things that is costs very little to kind of create and has a big return on investment is gambling. And so that's why we end up there. But these myths, they're young in the terms of mythology, but they're very long lasting. And so that was surprising for me to find out.
Do you all have any input in any of those questions that we previously asked before I moved on to the next one? Dr. Velasco?
Earlier, Parker said, well, if you want to learn more, read about these cases. Well, I do want to plug your paper that you've written something that is important, and you're not going to find in a book like Forced Federalism, which is very important. Right. People, that should be required reading, in my opinion, but for every American. But your paper really takes it further in terms of McGirt and these cases that came out since. forced federalism was published.
Yeah.
So, and for the average reader that wants to get it synthesized quickly, quicker than a long book, I think
Right,
your
yeah.
paper is very important.
Thank you. Yeah.
Something we didn't, because there's many different ways you could have gone with all this information you've digested for this project, Parker. And I mean, we definitely know that you've really done a deep dive here, and you have so much information that you could share. Something we didn't get into as much is the different liberal or conservative leanings of the justices themselves, and how that has impacted things over time. Because in current times, that's a big discussion piece about our justices and how we have a conservative majority right now. What does that mean? And even the meanings of
Sure.
that has changed over time. But if you want to speak to that, maybe.
Yeah. Actually, it's probably no better symbolized by the disagreement between the two conservative justices I mentioned in the current court of Gorsuch, Justice Neil Gorsuch, and then Justice Brett Kavanaugh. Now, the court has flip-flopped back and forth through the generations. Now, justices in the past didn't serve as long as they do now. Most of the time, they served about 10 years, and they're like, okay, I'm going to go retire, bye. And now they serve a lot longer. And so, yeah, throughout the early part of the 20th century, the court was very conservative. Even though that's the progressive era of American politics, it's still a very conservative court in the way they're deciding these things. It's not until the years of the New Deal and FDR do we really get a switch to a more kind of liberal, in the sense that we understand it, court that goes forward. And then once Thurgood Marshall gets on the court, I mean, talk about a guy who is a consummate, kind of guiding light for people that want to see someone who's very consistent in his views and goes forward with his views always through the same lens, and then serves a whole long time. I mean, he's serving a very long time. But then you have justices that start conservative and maybe get a little more liberal on throughout their time, and then justices that maybe get a little bit more conservative. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is one who is a liberal kind of superstar. But one of her first decisions is this Oneida v. Sherrill case, which is a case about land holdings. And so the Oneida tribe was dispossessed throughout the centuries, and then they couldn't get their land back through public auction, so they privately bought land. And they bought all this land back, and then once they had kind of collected their lands back through private sales, they then tried to assert authority through just by being a tribal nation and saying this land is now ours as reserved. And she writes this case or this opinion that says, yeah, that's great. You didn't do it the right way. There are processes for you to go through, and you didn't do that. So this jurisdiction doesn't apply to you anymore. And then again, back to Kavanaugh and Gorsuch. Gorsuch is a guy, he's the only justice from the western part of the United States. He's born, I think, in Denver, right? And so he's kind of the only one on the bench today that has ever dealt probably with native reservation lands, or at least been on them in a way that he's probably mindful of. And the man knows more about indigenous law than I think anyone on the court probably ever has, except for maybe Thurgood Marshall. And that's when you read his opinion in McGirt, and then you read his dissent in Casuerta, that becomes extremely clear. His thoughtful process of thinking, his thoughtful, deliberative explanation. I mean, he is explaining centuries, 2 centuries of court cases, essentially. And he's doing it incredibly thoughtfully and succinctly, and in a way that is accessible. And he's doing it because he thinks, this is really what we're supposed to be doing. This is our job as justices, is to interpret law and then to hand down a decision that everyone is accessible and reading. There's that idea that legalese is really kind of hard to understand, but once you get past a couple of like the weird V's and so forth, it reads perfectly fine. You can get through it. But yeah, the court flips back and forth. I mean, there are liberal justices that read very narrowly on laws, and there are conservative justices that read extremely narrow on laws, but it helps out in some ways, in this context.
So do you think that
but
has,
the court,
sorry to interrupt, Parker, but do you think that
no,
back
yeah,
and forth of the the political leanings of the justices have played a role in this, basically your summary of the case law that we've seen in the Supreme Court, kind of going back and forth. Do you think that has played a role in that?
I think it has to. Okay, I think it's definitely something that should be explored. It's not something I explored in my paper, but it is there, and you can definitely see when the court is leaning more of a liberal way or a more conservative way. You can really start to plot out, how these decisions are going to go. Now there are always surprises with the court. They don't answer to really anyone, and so they can make decisions, free of retribution in many ways. And so, I think that for the modern court from like the 50s onward probably has a lot more of the back and forth sway of justice's ideology, because they become a lot more kind of concrete in that ideology, especially starting in the 80s. Rehnquist is on the court, Sandra Day O'Connor becomes, a justice. The 80s to now are very, very lockstep in their ideology. But before that, it was still kind of there. And then, but going back a lot further, like to Marshall and then some of the courts in the 1800s, I don't think it's necessarily political ideology. I think in those eras, it's probably more general thought processes around, consideration of what Native Americans are. Are they really people? Are they a separate people? Are they a separate nation? General kind of what we would consider racism today, which was just more generally accepted then. I think that is more in line with probably the 1800s and the 1700s, whereas going forward from 1930 on, there's more of a ideological lean to how they do things. If that answers your question.
No, that's good.
Mm-hmm.
So, Parker, I guess as we round out our episode, what do you think the future holds, and what do you hope that listeners take away from this podcast, from this episode today, and from anybody reading your paper?
Hopefully they learn something. That's the biggest thing. But the future, I think what the future holds, especially for questions of sovereignty and jurisdiction, is a lot of difficulty, to be quite honest with you. The decisions handed down recently look to show a schism in legal theory. Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Gorsuch are both more conservative justices. They rely on a stricter reading of the law, a more narrow contextual reading of the law. And if they're disagreeing in decisions, that doesn't bode well for, future cases. On the one hand, the McGirt case pushes the onus back on Congress and says, hey, you have a responsibility here laid out in the Constitution to treat with these nations. And you have kind of abandoned that for the last 30 or 40 years. I think the last major legislation for, Indigenous Americans regarding rights is in the 90s, probably. So 30 years ago. And so he's kind of saying, okay, you have to pick up the ball again. It's not the court's job to hand out law. It's the court's job to interpret law. But in the Castro Huerta case, it rejects that totally, on the other hand, and says, states have this right through a reading of the 10th Amendment that they have this non-preemptive right to make decisions for everyone in their borders. And so there's a fight on the brewing right now between whether states have the right to dictate to sovereign nations, which is what these people are. And that's difficult because one is a constitutionally protected, entity in state governments. They have an amendment, the 10th Amendment. They have that there. It retains sovereignty for them. And the other is more of an interpretation of one phrase and one clause in the Constitution. So that is going to be very interesting to see going forward. But perhaps looking forward, the Holland v. Bracken case is coming up. It's been heard right now in the court, and this looks to decide whether the Indian Child Welfare Act is constitutional. do tribes have the right to decide what happens to children that fall within their designation, or does that right lay with the states? And so whichever way that case is decided is either a win for sovereignty or a loss for sovereignty. And so that right now, that I thought when I was writing this originally, Castro Huerta was still being decided. And when McGirt came out, I was like, okay, that means Castro Huerta is going to go this way. And that means, because of the way McGirt went, I know how that's going to happen. And then Castro Huerta was handed down. I go, well, I don't know what's going to happen next. So I think a lot of difficulty and a lot of confusion is going to happen to go forward, at least in the future. But what I hope that people take from this episode, to answer the second part of that question, is, to remember that Indigenous people and Indigenous nations are not just figments of the past. A lot of times we put them in the past. We think of them as before, right? But they're still very much here and will forever be here. They're never going to go anywhere. I hope that they can learn to investigate the machine of government that kind of runs all of our lives and try and examine its outputs in new ways and from differing perspectives, seeing it from the government side, seeing it from the person that's affected by the government. And I hope mostly that they feel like that, like I said, like they've learned something from this episode and this paper, because that's really the key. Is if you can feel like you've learned something, then you're right. You go onto social media and you try and ask questions, or you go onto Google and you start, Googling things, and you go onto Wikipedia for all that that's worth. You start reading, things, and you find podcasts to listen to, and you find YouTube videos to watch. That's really my goal here, is to get people interested in something.
Okay, do y'all have any final thoughts, any final comments? Maybe any questions that we have coming in?
And that's the point. I don't know if we have anybody unmute their mic to ask a question. Would that? I was hoping that would.
Oh, if that was a possibility.
We could try it.
Yeah, we could try
Jonas Jonas or Gabe, if either of you have a question, maybe one of you, maybe Jonas, you look like you have a question. You're leaning forward. You want to try it and just see?
Can you hear me?
Oh,
yeah.
We can.
Yes.
Go for it. Ask your question.
Well, Parker, hello, I'm Jonas. I'm in Dr. Velasco's class.
Hello.
Now, the one thing that just really stumped me is when you talked about the inconsistencies on the courts.
Sure.
When did that start? Is that something new, or have they always been inconsistent? That's not reassuring to me.
It's a fantastic question. And I'm sorry to say this, they've always been that way.
Right.
The inconsistencies have been there since the court wrote itself into existence in, I think Griswold v. Connecticut or something like that, way back in the day. And that's just the nature of, because these are human beings. I think we forget that as well. We forget that our politicians are human. We forget that our justices are human. We forget that, we can look back. Everyone says hindsight's 20/20. That's not true. Hindsight is context. That's what it is. You're looking at it with context of what the events that were decided in that moment, the decisions taken in that moment, and how they have panned out. And so that inconsistency is there. Now, I will give the early justices, let's say until 1820, maybe even 1830, I'll give them a little caveat there of they're writing unprecedented opinions here. They're creating law. They're creating parameters of interpretation. And they're using kind of an outdated form of English common law that they're trying to adapt to this new world. And they're trying to say, well, this is how we used to do it. Well, because they all studied in England or under English parameters. But we're not England anymore. So how does that work? So I'll give them a caveat of they're trying to figure it out. But as the country expands and as the court becomes more and more, sedentary in its ways, and it's becoming an institution, it really starts to become more of a, what's in vogue thinking, and then also what is the ideology coming through, and again, they're human beings. So I don't want to villainize any of them, because, I don't know. I think I know the decision I would make, but I don't have the requisite knowledge of a Supreme Court justice. They're looking at stuff from a real 30,000 foot view, and then they're trying to make decisions that they know will affect hundreds of thousands, even millions of people. But yeah, that inconsistency, unfortunately, it's been there since the beginning. But that's what makes it interesting, because it was just lockstep one way and it never changed. That's unfortunately, I know that's not always fun, but it's not interesting if it's that way. But it's more interesting this way to see that the court can change through time. There is hope forward if you bring this question again. I think it's kind of the silver lining there.
Well, I think daily we are still all trying to figure it out. So,
yeah.
Parker, thank you so much. This was so enlightening. You definitely know what you're talking about. We love a social justice king. And hopefully, we can all leave here and get on our socials, get on our podcast, and even if it's one paragraph, one page, something new that people delve into to educate themselves, you made a difference. I think Dr. Velasco has a couple of thoughts.
I just wanted to comment on, what we've just seen is the showcasing of some excellent work that was produced here at Sul Ross by a Sul Ross graduate student.
Right.
And some people watching and or listening might have been wondering, is this I've just caught it in the middle. Maybe I'm watching someone from Harvard talking.
Right.
Or who's this professor that's talking? His name is it Dr. Duff? This is one of our own.
Yeah.
He's a graduate student, and he's been on a long path. He's been on a journey, and I think it's important to point that out to student viewers, and maybe even potential students and parents at home, and even maybe Parker's loved ones, and the nation of the Choctaw people. He's done some very important work to bring a lot of research to light, and this is something that is vital for 2022 and beyond, and I'm proud to be part of it.
And I am as well, and I'll just chime in and say that at the beginning of this, I remember, Parker, when we were going through getting your, when you're trying to pick your project and trying to get your direction, I remember you saying something about it, that you were trying not to think too much about what are you going to do with this. But then I remember you mentioning that it was important to you, kind of as we started getting into it, that you wanted this to be more than just a paper. You wanted it to do more.
Yeah.
And I think that this platform has definitely provided that kind of jumping off point for you to share what you've learned and to get other people interested. And I'm really proud to have been part of your journey as well.
Yeah. You've done some excellent
Thank you.
work.
I mean, like the Dr. Velasco's have said, it's been a long path forward. There's been definitely trying times, but without their support, and I couldn't have done this. They're encouraging, and they're just belief that I could do this, which is amazing, and something that if you ever get the chance to work with them, take it. It's the best thing that's ever happened to me academically. So I can't say enough about that. And then also just Sul Ross and the ability to create something that is unique. And with the project type that we have, there's no set parameter, which is great. So we're able to kind of go in and out. And then growing in confidence as I have now, at the beginning of my studies, I would never have been able to imagine I could sit down and talk to people and answer questions like this, and feel confident about the answers I gave. And now, because of this and the things I've learned, I can, and that is something I'll be forever grateful for.
Thank you so much.
Thank y'all so much. Supreme Court, tears and laughter. That's what we got on this podcast. A whole roller coaster of emotions. Thank y'all, everybody,
Absolutely.
for joining us. Parker, I look forward to hearing more from you. Thank you so much, Dr. Velasco's. Thank you to Bobby, our media guy. And just a reminder that we do have a counseling and accessibility services office in Ferguson Hall 112. If anybody has any comments or thoughts that they would like to discuss. And we do have Lobo Pantry in Ferguson Hall, room 108. And if you listeners have any other topics that you suggest that we bring up, or any people that you would like to submit for us to bring onto the podcast, please email us at odei@soros.edu. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and I'm going to sign off. Lobos, keep howling because your voice matters.